And I begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri as the owners of this land, the custodians of this land on which we're meeting, and I pay respects to elders past and present, and I acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander who is with us now or who will be with us later in the day, and we thank them for their attendance. It's very nice to be here. Thank you very much, Sandeep, for inviting me. We have numbers of key speakers today. I particularly note that later in the day you have the Honourable, the famous, the most distinguished and great friend of Deakin, Michael Kirby, and I'm pleased he's not here. And I do apologise that we've started early, and there is gridlock in the town. And of course, many people who use public transport or indeed are trying to find a car park are somewhere beneath us trying to get here. And we thank you all for your indulgence, but we must begin. And of course, the great aspect of access, inclusion, participation and diversity is we record everything. We put it on Deakin Air, which you can get via iTunes, and it's there in perpetuity. And people, many, many people who can't be here today will be able to notice that. So I'm very pleased to be here and I welcome you all. I thought I would say a bit about diversity. It's quite an important issue for me. Many of you will not know that I was born in Zambia. Often the first comment I get when people meet me not having gone to the web to see my photograph saying, "Oh, I thought you'd be black." And there's a level of disappointment which is, you overcome quite easily. But of course, I was born in Zambia and I did live in South Africa. And my view of the world is informed by living and being educated up until the end of my first degree in the apartheid regime. I do understand about separation. I absolutely understand very clearly about exclusion. And I do know that that lived experience is corrosive, corrupting, and that you are either guilty forever because you joined the separation, or you are guilty forever because you did nothing. And somewhere in amongst that, many, many people just like me have come into the world, into other places. Many have gone back to South Africa. My brother, after we all left as a consequence of apartheid, when the view was remove your intellectual property and things will change. Of course, I left, I waved my mother goodbye. I thought I'll be back in 5 years. 20 years later, it took before there was any change. And that famous picture of Nelson Mandela walking out of the jail with Winnie next to him with her hand up in the air. And I will remember that until my dying day as the moment when you realised that things would change in South Africa. The great thing about that change was there was a great leader. There was a great leader who had spent over 25 years in jail, in a miserable jail, who came out and said, we won't do this punitively, we will not have a war, we will have truth and reconciliation, and we will work together, and he did that. And I think for many of us, we followed that example. There is no point in ranting and railing about inequity. The only thing you can do is do something about it. And it is quite interesting what we can and can't do about it. But I'm optimistic today, and I'll talk a bit now about marriage equality. So at Deakin, the marriage equality bill was writ large. We are 56,000 students, we are 7,000 staff. We have values of access and inclusion and participation. These are things that are important to us. The university took a view, I took a view, that we should encourage everyone to exercise their democratic right. We also took a view that the university itself did not have a vote, but that the people in it, those who were registered to vote, had a vote. So we did three things. We encouraged everyone who was not on the register to get registered. We did a lot of active work in that. It was quite interesting, the number of under 25s who were not on the electoral roll. So that was our first good deed to the democracies. We encouraged many, many, many of them to get enrolled. The second thing I did was I expressed my view that I would vote yes as an individual, but I declined to say what the university would do because access and participation means the broad community must be included so that their voice is heard. I have nothing against anyone who voted no. That is not the point. What I thought we should do is exercise our democracy. What was interesting was how many people objected to me expressing my view that I had overreached And my view back was, but we are talking about a very significant group of people in Australia who do not have the rights that the vast majority have. And if we're a university and we say we celebrate diversity, access and participation, what else can we do as the leader? And I am your leader. So then we went ahead, and of course I gave everybody a stern warning that you will be respectful, you will respect each other's arguments. And I'm pleased to say that at Deakin we had less trouble than a number of other large institutions had. People did broadly respect that. The interesting thing for Australia, in a country where often, and I agree with you, Sandeep, you often wonder, you walk in the streets and then your working life is different. I'm one of, I think it's 9 or 10 vice-chancellors out of 41 who are women. And I remember someone saying, oh my goodness, that's great, now we can get on. No, there have to be 50, we need 20 vice-chancellors, we need double. And I remember that one of the people we were saying this to sort of took a step back, and we had to calm him down. Look, the world won't collapse with any more female vice-chancellors, but we need to get on. We have one vice-chancellor, in fact, who is Indian, Deep Saini at the University of Canberra. On my executive in 12, we have one person who is ethnically diverse, and he's male, not female. We're balanced, actually, on male-female, but we're all Anglo-Celtic, actually, when you get down to it. So the diversity is on gender only, and we need to think about the other forms of diversity. We have no one on our council who is Indigenous. No one at the moment. We need someone. I mean, every day we comment and we record our respect for First Nations people. We have an Institute of Career Education, and we have no independent member who is Indigenous, which brings me nicely back to the Marriage Equality Bill. So we got to the vote then, and there were some very interesting conversations. I remember one where I was talking to a whole group of first years and saying, you must, have you all enrolled? Yes, we've all enrolled. And then this one young woman describing, she said, it was really cute, getting the form and ticking the box. And then I took it down. I've never really posted letters. And you do realise the generational split between those. When I left South Africa, I wrote to my mother every week. I used to buy in 10 packs of 10 aerograms. Nobody knows what an aerogram is anymore. I actually have one that I brought into work so I could show a few people. And I used to write one of those every week, and she would receive it and I would get one back. And that was the deal. That was the equivalent of WhatsApp, was once a week. And so our students all voted, and here's the gruesome fact for you. So the people voted. 80% of people said, I will have my view, and they did. The government thought that 25% of people would come out on a voluntary vote. That's what they estimated. Australia Post hedged a bit and thought, no, let's make it 30%. Let's expect 30% of envelopes to come back, because, of course, they were the people having to do the whole deal. 80% of the registered Australians voted. Isn't that the most optimistic thing about where the future of diversity in this country will go? What a great celebration it was. Not so much that people said yes or no, but that people bothered to use their vote. It is unprecedented in democracies around the world that 80% of people use quite a complicated system. You had to fill out a form, you had to put another envelope, you had to go and find a postbox, you had to put it in the postbox by a due date. Ridiculous. Everything should have been just electronic in the normal way that we've done quite a few things. But the ABS, of course, couldn't risk that, but I think there was a deliberate attempt maybe to only get 25% of the vote. So the first thing I'd say is there's great hope in Australia for what we will do. The other great hope for me is those 18-year-olds, because in one of the groups I was talking to, and this was all post the whole thing, one of the students said, it's amazing. We've changed this thing. What's the next thing we should be looking at? And I thought if the Prime Minister was here, his heart would stop. Because, of course, there's Manus Island, where we could probably put the referendum to the people and see what happened. There is whether Indigenous people should be at the front of the Constitution and what the people might say in a voluntary postal. I wouldn't go postal, it's too much money, but you could go electronic. We could do what the Swiss do and start to test some of these things with our people, and whether we then accelerated the whole movement of diversity. Because in the end, what I learned as a being I'm a Zambian, so I can't stand for Parliament. Section 44, I'm actually a Zambian citizen, and I'm a European, UK or Euro. I have a Euro passport, and I have an Australian passport. I consider myself Australian, so I'd have to go and say right to two lots of people if I wanted to stand for Parliament. But what it said to me is that there's a future and you can change things. Nelson Mandela changed South Africa. The democracy is going through its moments in South Africa. Do not be critical of the democracy in South Africa or the democracy in Zimbabwe. Think of our own democracy and what we need to do and the things we need to change, and there's hope for all of us. So I do want to say a bit about the language of the law is the language of decision-making. And if some of these things are going to be fixed anywhere, it is by our lawmakers and our people who understand our constitution and the various laws to make sure that we are clear around issues of gender, of age, and of diversity in all its forms. And we often think of it quite narrowly about colour, but we do need to think about the diversities of culture and religion and what all of this means. First Australians, older people, people with disabilities who are technically invisible most of the time until we want to pay attention to them. And then we like them. And then we get really cross when we think about how much the NDIS is going to cost. And we need to think about these people. But I agree. I did some homework as well. There are 550 Indigenous solicitors out of Australia's 66,000 solicitors. Let's go to the bottom of the pyramid where things must start. 550 Indigenous solicitors out of 66,000. There are many, many, many fewer accountants. And if you think of our Indigenous peoples, the one thing they would benefit from in their small, medium enterprises, people who understand business. Almost no Indigenous people do business because of their experience with corporate Australia in the deep, dark old days. We need to change that. The 1.6% of barristers, 0.8% of the judiciary of Asian background, although the last census showed they represented about 10% of the population. And while the number of female solicitors is increasing, they remain underrepresented in the senior ranks. And as I said at Deakin, there's one person of ethnic diversity on my executive, and my aspiration is we must represent the population and get that to 3. So I think diversity matters, both as a strength and as an asset, and also as a signal of optimism. Optimism means that you can almost, if you set your mind to it, you can at least have a go and try and achieve something. And we all need to think about that and how we each can do more. It's one thing to wag the finger and say the government must do it. Each of us, as a Vice-Chancellor, I take it very seriously. What do I do in our student population? I was sitting at graduations and somebody said to me at graduations, all these people coming across the stage, they're just taking the places of Australian students. And it was a great moment because at that moment, our Chancellor, who is a very gracious man and smiles and says congratulations, and the young man coming past him was clearly of Vietnamese origin. And he went, "On ya, mate," and hugged the Chancellor. He was clearly a third-generation Australian by every standard, and he was not taking the place of an Australian because he was an Australian. How do we deal with that prejudice in our community who makes assumptions about gender, about colour, and about religion? So that's all I pretty much had to say. I think the optimism of marriage equality has been great. Perhaps we should all be in favour of voluntary votes, postal or otherwise, because the community is out of step with the meritocracy, with the bureaucracy, and with the leadership of Australia. That looks very different. You're absolutely right, Sandeep, is that it looks very different at the top. But the real lived experiment at the bottom of the pyramid, and the famous Indian philosopher, the gold is at the bottom of the pyramid. It's where the people are. It's where the ideas are. That lived experience is completely different. And that lived experience is our strength. It is our asset. But it is our Achilles heel if we do nothing and people become pessimistic. So congratulations. I hope the traffic eases up and you get more people come. I do acknowledge Michael Kirby most particularly, and I hope he is going to say some wonderfully uplifting things after his long campaign for marriage equality in Australia. and his long campaign for looking at diversity and making sure that differences are celebrated rather than used in a divisive manner. To all of you, congratulations for being part of the conversation. From small things, big things grow, and we need to start being much more active, much more vocal in our community, and we should do that from a position of confidence, because if there's one thing we know from the Marriage Equality Bill was that for years and for the last 10 years, the pop polls have been showing it's probably a 60-40 yes vote. The government was convinced it wasn't, and even Tony Abbott has had to concede that in his constituency that got the highest yes vote of any constituency in Australia, that he was wrong. Didn't he talk to his constituents? Didn't he just talk to 30 of them and get a relationship? And we could have avoided some of the harm and some of the hurt and some of the awful partisan politics that has gone over in the last 6 weeks, and included a population in an even more optimistic way than we currently did. But that was then. This is now. We've proved that the people, the bottom of the pyramid, actually does know when to get things right. You remember the last referendum we got right was when we included Indigenous Australians, and then we got this one right. So the Australian people broadly actually do know the difference between right and wrong. The rest of us, the leadership, and to all the young people in the room, remember this: when you are in charge and you have power, do not forget your origins. Do not forget where you came from, and do not forget that the greatest values are excellence, they are participation, they are access, and they are, of course, inclusion. And I'll just end with one thing. I was looking at what Barack Obama, Barack Obama is another hero on this matter. He recently spoke of the dangers our community faces when it withdraws into little bubbles of people who all agree with each other and hold the same view, and who just reinforce that view. A problem put in the spotlight by social media, which causes social, and I quote, social tribes of people with similar views and who unfriend, who unfollow those with whom they don't agree. Absolutely, I agree with that. I force myself to read The Australian every day. I don't agree with most of what's in The Australian. It's important that I read it. We need to read things that are different from our own view, and you need to listen actively to people who have different views to yours, so that you understand where they come from and what it is that they mean. And I think if we do that, and we will always do that at Deakin, people have a right to be heard. They don't have a right to be agreed with. They have a right to be heard, and we have a right to defend another position if there has been. We've taken a bit of criticism over the last few years by enabling people with some interesting views to have voice. But we've always reserved the right to have a right of reply to that voice, and we've done that respectfully. And I hope that the young in the audience will remember that as they grow up. Be inclusive, let people have their say, because the bottom of the pyramid can sort out the wheat from the chaff very quickly. Congratulations, and thank you particularly to our panel, who are presumably going to give a much more academic view to all of this, and what we can do about improving the future. I'm going to have to go because, of course, it's the season to be merry, but also the season to pass students, to listen to appeals, to graduate them, to admit them, and then to do the final accounts of the year, because we do everything by the second week of December. So it's a pretty crazy time for most managers in universities, and do apologies if I step out of the room in about 10 minutes. Thank you very much.